One of the biggest supporters of Canadian music is actually Australian. He's award-winning rock journalist, author, and interviewer Ritchie Yorke, who went on to work closely with John Lennon, Van Morrison, and Led Zeppelin, among others. Ritchie says his interest in music began during his teen years in his native Australia.
I was 16 years old. I got a job in an out-of-town radio station in a rather conservative Bible Belt type area, Toowoomba in Australia. And I had a weekly radio show on a Saturday night where I played records. By then I'd gotten myself somehow on the Motown mailing list out of Detroit. I was getting records shipped out every week from Motown, and one came up one week called Fingertips Part 2 by this guy no one had heard of, Little Stevie Wonder. Turned out he was 12 years old and blind, and even more, this song went to #1 on the American charts, as did his album, The 12-Year-Old Genius. This had never happened before. This area that I was in was somewhat racist, and I was called into the program manager's office after I first played this record, and they said to me, I quote, "We don't want none of that nigger music here, boy. Do not play that on our station." So I thought, gee, this is interesting. I felt there was time to draw a line. So the next Saturday night I went to work at the station, locked myself in the studio and put on Fingertips again and played it 8 times until they got down there and fired me from working on the station. That was when I realized early in the piece that if I wanted to pursue rhythm and blues music by Afro-American artists, I was probably in the wrong country.
So in 1966, Ritchie packed his bags and moved to England, where he landed a job with Island Records. A year and a half later, he packed up once more and this time headed for Canada.
So I came to Canada and was, warmly embraced here and got here. And even though I couldn't find a job at first, it was very difficult and no one cared that I'd been involved in rock and roll in England. But I wanted to get to where rock and roll came from. So I came to Canada, which I knew was next to the United States and would give me access, I thought, to what lay ahead. But this journey I only expected to be 18 months. It turned out to be 20 years.
When Ritchie arrived in Canada, the music scene was still growing. Ritchie Yorke was a major force in taking it to the next level.
I knew nothing about the Canadian music scene, basically, except one record I'd heard, Fortune Teller by Bobby Catola. But I got here, and as it happened, strangely enough, I discovered a scene just about ready to burst forth. And all it was lacking was belief. And my first trip to the United States was with the Lords of London, a Canadian group who had a hit at that time called Cornflakes and Ice Cream. So my first ever step on the United States soil was in Cleveland, which is to many the birthplace of rock and roll. It's certainly where Alan Freed got the radio coverage going. The Canadian music scene was very interesting to me because people could really play, but there was no ownership of it locally. No one really thought much of this. It didn't really mean much to Canadians. And I got involved with a campaign involving some other Canadian people who saw things in a similar light. People such as Walt Grealis and Stan Cleese of RPM and Richard Flohill, the publicist. And we began a campaign to get the CRTC to introduce a domestic content quota, which struck me as being the way to create an industry immediately. You create the music and then there'll be a demand. And, there's been a lot of talk about whether that was good or bad since. I still say to this day it was the best thing that ever happened to Canadian music. All these wonderful artists that have come out of Canada, I doubt if they would have if there hadn't been that Canadian content law. For years, people were cursing me because they had to play these beavers, these Canadian records they didn't want to play because it was easy to follow the American program experts who said play this, 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 and this, and it just had created something new, and I really think it's a good thing. I mean, it's a pity that you do have to legislate to make a culture happen, but I think in this case you did.
In late May of 1969, one of Ritchie's rock and roll pals called to say he was in Toronto for a few days and wanted to get together. That pal was John Lennon.
I established a relationship with John and with Derek Taylor, and when Derek and John and Yoko arrived here from the Bahamas, they gave me a call. "Ritchie, come on down and let's have a chat. Love to see you." So I went down, did an interview for the Globe, and we also talked about where the Bedin might be held. We sat and talked in this room about was Toronto the right place, and I didn't think it was. It was the old good grey Toronto of those days. They rolled up the sidewalk at night. It was not the city it is now. I thought that Montreal was a more sophisticated city and more suitable to do an international bet in, and also it was an hour's flight from New York, which enabled the media to come up from New York and interview John. That was the whole purpose of it, to get the message to Americans when John couldn't get entry. This is an area of his life that I don't think's been documented all that much. This little period when Canada played such a big role in John's life. When in 1969, the country that he really wanted to be in, because good things happened, was Canada. I think it's a great acknowledgement of Canada's position in 1969, that it was a country thought of as free-spirited, different than America because it wasn't involved in the Vietnam War, and encouraging people who didn't want to kill people in Vietnam to come up and find a home here. I mean, I just thought it was so wonderful that John and Yoko were using their fame for something very positive, rather than just glorifying their own egos, which so many rock artists did in that day and now. They were trying to present a message. They were trying to bring social change through music, and I think that's a very noble intention.
John and Yoko quickly left Toronto and set up camp in room 1742 at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, where they began a week-long bed-in for peace. Ritchie Yorke was in that hotel room on June 1st, 1969, the day they recorded John Lennon's anthem, Give Peace a Chance.
There were maybe 30 people in the room, all there for different reasons, but, you know, bashing on phone books, playing out of time. It was an incredibly difficult record to record. I mean, here's John playing guitar and Tommy Smothers on guitar, and that was all fine. But you've got a whole bunch of other people yelling and screaming and clapping out of time, and it was very difficult. But John was so aware of the power of the media, and if you could just harness it and, you know, direct it in the right way, you could really make an impact. And he did. One of the problems with the Amsterdam bet-in was the British media tore over there expecting to see John and Yoko nude and making love on their bed, because that's where their brains immediately went when they heard there was a bet-in for peace. Oh, John and Yoko will be, you know, in their bed, and what a great cover for The Sun tomorrow. This is, maybe it'll beat The Sun Page 3 Girl, you know. I mean, that was the sort of mentality. So they had an uphill battle just to get the credibility of the press. The Montreal bet-in enabled a lot of messages to go out in a very good way. It was a very tumultuous time, and John was actually able to spread a very calming influence on things.
In September of '69, Ritchie was in England on the very day that Canadian rock promoter John Brower phoned John Lennon to ask him to come and play the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival.
It's all about timing in rock and roll, and that was the absolute proof of it. I walked into the Apple offices because I had organised an interview with George for the following Monday to talk about Abbey Road, and I just wanted to go in and make sure everything was together. And John heard me in the corridor just as John Brower rang him and was pitching him, come over to Toronto, you know, there's this great show we got going on with all these idols you've got, people you love. And he just wanted John and Yoko to come along as guests, but to them that was like being the king and queen at some tournament. And they immediately wanted to play. If they were going to be there, they'd play. And so I was able to convince John that John Brower and his associates were good people, worth dealing with. It was a legitimate offer, and give it a chance. Little did I know, really, that John was just desperate to get out of the Beatles and that he wanted an opportunity to play without them. It all just fell into place. As I say, it's all about good timing.
John and Yoko flew back to Canada in December of '69 for a meeting with then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau to discuss the Lennon's peace campaign. The couple took a train from Toronto to Ottawa, where they met with Trudeau, then had an additional meeting with Health Minister John Munro.
It seemed logical that we needed to have John connect with the politicians of Canada. He'd been to Canada for epic events twice in 1969. He's coming back in December, and it's obvious that we should get him together with the Prime Minister, who was, of course, at that time a very understanding and amiable man with a world view second to none, Pierre Trudeau. John had been ignored by other political leaders. It was a logical thing that Trudeau and John Lennon should meet, and it was a wonderful meeting. I mean, here's a guy who's met everybody that matters in the world, essentially. I mean, Elvis on down. Nothing is going to really overwhelm John, you wouldn't think. But he was really, really nervous about meeting the Prime Minister. He was like pacing the floor, smoking, chain smoking. He was smoking everything he could, just totally, nervous as heck. And there was a 10-minute interview schedule which turned into almost an hour, which speaks for itself.
John and Yoko asked Ritchie to help spread their war is over peace message. So Ritchie recruited rocker Ronnie Hawkins and hightailed it around the world.
We got to Hong Kong, did the press conference. Ronnie Hawkins and I travelled around the world, went to 15 countries, and we lob into Hong Kong and we do a fabulous press conference at the Mandarin Hotel. And then one of the younger reporters pipes up and says, it's all great to tell us, and suggest, John and Yoko's war is over if you want it. We obviously believe that. We're there for that. But what about this country nearby here with almost 1 billion people? They don't get it. Why don't you tell them? And me, being naive and young, said, sure, let's tell them. How can we, So from there, we rode out to Long Ma Chau, the border point, Ronnie Hawkins and myself, and held up posters at the border. Almost got arrested and somehow escaped unscathed from that little episode. But John and Yoko were so thrilled that we'd taken their message to the Red China border. I mean, this is before Richard Nixon or the ping pong players or anyone. I mean, no one's going to China. And we're at the border, they're holding up this war is over if you want it, and it was a good thing to do. But now I realise how dangerous and what a folly it was, really. I could have been dead,
In 1969, there was one new British band that Ritchie strongly believed in, Led Zeppelin, who had just released their debut album on Atlantic Records.
Well, Jerry Waxer of Atlantic Records very kindly sent me an advance white label acetate of the Led Zeppelin album, and with no publicity about it, nothing, just to have a listen to this. And I thought it was sensational. To me, it was obvious that Led Zeppelin were the next big thing. Strangely enough, it wasn't that obvious to other people, especially Rolling Stone and other publications who trashed the band's first album in a huge way. I didn't. And Peter Grant, their manager, and the band were always grateful for me for standing up at a time when other people didn't. I mean, plenty of people got on the bandwagon later and said, oh yeah, I always knew Led Zeppelin, but they were a bit thin in the ranks when it started. They were very gracious and invited me on all their tours. Whenever anything significant was happening with them, they invited me down to cover it at their expense. And it was just a wonderful relationship.
During his career, Ritchie has written 8 books and contributed chapters to many others. His 1971 book on Canadian music, Axis Chops and Hot Licks, although long out of print, remains a classic. So, after more than 40 years of observation, what does Ritchie think about the music scene in Canada today?
I think it's great. Overall, as a grandfather or whatever of all this stuff, I am so proud to see what's happened, and so much great music has come out of Canada. It's all about adventure, innovation, fabulous new music, and no one's copying the Americans, they're showing the Americans how to do it here. And I think that's wonderful.